He came to me quietly, looking nervous, almost broken. I never imagined that what he was about to reveal would unravel the life I thought I was living, and turn everything I trusted upside down.
It started with a knock. A quiet, almost hesitant sound against the wood. I hadn't been expecting anyone that morning, and for a second I just stood there, coffee in hand, listening. I remember the silence that followed it, the kind that doesn't feel natural, like the world is holding its breath. When I opened the door, my neighbor Tom stood there, his face pale, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets as if trying to hide something not just from me, but from himself. Tom had always been a background figure in our lives. Polite waves across the lawn, borrowed tools, the occasional barbecue invitation. He and his wife Lena had lived next door for almost 5 years. We were close in the way neighbors sometimes are, familiar, but surface level. Still, I liked him. Everyone did. He had a calm presence, a steady kind of quietness that made you feel safe. That day, though, something in his eyes was trembling. I invited him in without asking why he was there. Something about his expression didn't leave space for questions. He sat on the edge of the couch like he was afraid it would swallow him whole. I poured another cup of coffee and set it in front of him, untouched. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was full. I could feel it pressing into the walls. He didn't speak that morning. Not really. He said only a few sentences, fragmented, indirect, and heavy. I remember watching his hands tremble as he tried to form words. But what he didn't say, what he couldn't say, was louder. He left not long after, mumbling something about needing time to think. And he left behind a silence that refused to leave. Something shifted in me after that. Like a thread had been pulled loose, and suddenly I could feel the tension winding through every corner of my life. I started noticing things I had ignored for too long. The way my husband looked away when certain topics came up, how often he picked up his phone only to frown and put it back down. I told myself it was stress, work, life. But the silence Tom brought with him stayed. That evening, I sat by the window and watched the lights in their house flicker on. Lena wasn't home. She often worked late, at least, that's what I had always believed. Tom paced back and forth in their living room, rubbing his face with both hands like someone trying to wake up from a nightmare. I should have gone back to pretending everything was normal. But I couldn't. Over the next few days, I noticed myself drifting through my own life like a visitor. I still cooked dinner, still laughed at the right moments, still kept the house in order, but it all felt like I was playing a part in someone else's script. I started to question how many moments in my life had been real, and how many had been carefully curated to keep me asleep. It wasn't long before I began to follow the trail of unease. I started small. A message in my husband's phone that seemed innocuous, but was deleted by the time I went to reread it. A look between Tom and my husband at a neighborhood gathering. Too fast, too sharp. A missed call from Lena's number at 1:42 a.m. that my husband claimed was spam. I didn't want to believe it. I clung to denial like it could protect me. But denial is fragile. And the truth, once it starts dripping in, doesn't stop until it floods everything. I began piecing things together in silence. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't ask questions. I just watched, listened, waited. One night, I woke up and found my husband standing in the hallway, whispering into his phone. He claimed he was checking on a sick coworker. He didn't look at me when he said it. That week, Lena didn't come home for 3 nights in a row. Tom stayed home from work. I saw him in his backyard more often, standing still, staring at the ground like he was trying to unearth something buried beneath it. I started to feel like we were both orbiting the same invisible collapse, circling closer and closer to something that neither of us could name aloud. Then one afternoon, I found something. A receipt in the laundry, folded neatly and tucked into the lining of my husband's jacket. It wasn't suspicious at first, until I looked at the date and realized he'd told me he was working late that night. And the location. A boutique hotel 20 minutes away. The same hotel I once saw Lena enter months ago, while I was driving past on an errand. It felt like the room around me tilted. I sat down on the edge of our bed, clutching the paper like it had burned me. I didn't cry. Not yet. My mind began unraveling everything, rewinding moments and layering them with new meanings. The laughter. The missed calls. The sudden kindness followed by distance. It all took on a new shape. I kept the receipt in a drawer. I didn't mention it. Not to him. Not to anyone. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake listening to the faint hum of the house, the occasional creak of wood expanding in the cool air. And I thought of Tom. His visit. His silence. The way his hands had trembled. He knew. I didn't know how much. I didn't know how long. But I knew in my bones that what he came to tell me that day was real, that behind all the fragments and hints was a truth too heavy to name. And for the first time, I was ready to dig. I didn't confront my husband. I didn't even let on that I suspected anything. That was the version of me he was used to. The quiet, supportive one who didn't dig too deep, who accepted explanations as truth without needing evidence. But I was no longer that woman. Not since Tom had stepped through my door with the weight of 100 unspoken words pressing down on him. That day had cracked something open, and there was no sealing it shut. I began documenting. Not with pictures or recordings. That would have made it feel like a crime scene. I kept everything in a notebook, hidden beneath the lining of an old purse in the back of my closet. Times. Glances. Excuses. Patterns. I started to see how often my husband was called away, how the calls always came just as I entered the room. His stories, which once seemed smooth, now rang hollow. I could hear the space between his words, where the truth had been scooped out and replaced with placeholders. I also began watching Lena. She didn't notice. Or maybe she did, and she was just as good at pretending as I had learned to be. I watched her come and go with an ease that now felt artificial. I remembered how close we had once been, how she had brought over muffins when I was sick, how she had cried in my kitchen about a job she hated. I wondered if any of it had ever been real. But Tom was the thread I couldn't untangle. After that first visit, he avoided me. He barely looked in my direction, and if we crossed paths, he would offer a stiff nod and disappear behind his front door. It was like he had stepped too close to something dangerous and didn't want to be caught in the fallout. I didn't blame him. I just couldn't let it go. One day, I saw him sitting in his car long after he'd pulled into his driveway. He stared ahead, unmoving, For nearly 20 minutes. The engine was off. The windows rolled up. Just him, and whatever thoughts had chained him to that seat. I watched from behind my curtain and wondered how deep his silence went. Whether he was holding on to truths that had poisoned his own life, or truths he was too afraid to share with mine. It was around then that I began to feel a subtle shift in myself. Like the version of me that had once depended on stability had died quietly, and something colder, sharper, more observant had taken its place. I didn't flinch when I found another receipt. I didn't cry when I saw my husband delete messages. I didn't rage when Lena waved at me with that bright smile. I had become a mirror, reflecting back exactly what they expected, while inside I calculated. It was a storm I was preparing for. Not a confrontation, not yet. But I needed more. I needed the kind of certainty that couldn't be explained away. And I got it 2 weeks later, entirely by accident. I had gone to drop off a package that had been mistakenly delivered to Tom and Lena's house. I almost left it on the porch, but something made me knock. It was Tom who answered. His face drained when he saw me. I could feel the tension before a word was even exchanged. I handed him the box and was about to turn when I noticed a dark red mark on his wrist. A bruise, faint but unmistakable. I didn't ask. He didn't explain. But he hesitated, and for the first time in weeks, his eyes met mine and didn't look away. There was something pleading in his expression. Something that said he was tired of carrying whatever weight he held. Later that night, I stood outside with a glass of wine, watching the street. I saw Lena's car pull into the driveway. I saw her step out, talking animatedly on the phone, laughing. I saw Tom come to the door, watching her with that same haunted expression. And I realized something I hadn't dared to consider before. Maybe he wasn't the only one hiding things. Maybe this wasn't just my betrayal. Maybe we were both caught in the same web, held hostage by the people we thought we knew. The final confirmation came 3 days later. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't explosive. It was quiet. A photo slipped under my front door in an unmarked envelope. I recognized the handwriting on the back. Tom's. No message. Just a date. And the photo. It showed my husband and Lena. Sitting at a cafe. Close. Intimate. Their heads leaned together like conspirators. His hand on hers. Her smile not meant for anyone but him. I stared at it for hours, as if the longer I looked, the more sense it would make. But it didn't. It only broke something permanent in me. I didn't know what to do with the picture. I didn't know what to do with myself. For a moment, I considered walking across the lawn and showing it to Lena. Or to my husband. Or maybe to both of them at once. But the thought filled me with exhaustion instead of satisfaction. I wasn't ready for the confrontation. Not yet. Instead, I folded the photo, placed it inside my notebook, and wrote the date at the top of the next blank page. This was no longer just a suspicion. It was a quiet war. And I intended to win it, no matter how many smiles I had to wear in the meantime. I stopped keeping track of days. It didn't feel useful anymore. Time had become soft and unstructured, like a fog I moved through without direction. My routines remained intact. Laundry, grocery runs, cooking dinner, but my thoughts no longer belonged to the present. They lived inside my notebook, in the ink of surveillance and memory. Everything I saw was a clue. Everything I didn't see was suspicion. I began tracking Lena's schedule. It was always the same. Pilates on Mondays and Thursdays, grocery shopping late Fridays, hair appointments once a month. My husband's schedule started to match hers in strange ways. I noticed him leaving early on Mondays. I noticed him buying groceries less. I noticed a new cologne, not cheap, not his. I noticed the way he looked through me when he spoke, like he wasn't fully present. I never stopped smiling. That had become my armor. My performance. The friendly wife. The friendly neighbor. The woman who didn't notice. It made them comfortable. Comfortable people are careless. I found another photo. This time, it wasn't in an envelope. It was tucked under my windshield wiper while I was parked at the pharmacy. Again, no message. Just a date. This time, a motel sign visible in the background. I didn't even need to see their faces. The body language was enough. Her hand on his chest. His arm wrapped tightly around her. A snapshot of intimacy, taken from a distance. I wondered if Tom had followed them there himself or if someone else was helping me. The possibility that I wasn't the only one hunting made my skin prickle. I burned the photo. I didn't want it. I didn't want to feel that again. Instead, I turned my attention to Tom. I had avoided him for weeks, sensing his discomfort, not wanting to push him. But one afternoon, he was outside raking leaves, and something in me cracked. I crossed the lawn and stood a few feet from him. He looked up, startled. I didn't say anything. I just waited. And after a moment, he dropped the rake and nodded. He didn't say it out loud. But I knew. He knew. He was tired. Tired of secrets. Tired of holding the weight alone. We sat on his porch steps for hours. He didn't speak much. But what he gave me was enough. It wasn't just that my husband and Lena were having an affair. It had started long before I suspected. It had started before my last birthday, before our last family vacation. There had even been talk, between them, about leaving us. About starting over. But they never did. They were still playing pretend, still smiling through dinners and double dates, still lying with their mouths and their bodies. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came when Tom, quietly and without emotion, told me something I hadn't considered. That he had once caught Lena messaging someone else. That he'd seen her delete names and save them under others. That he'd grown suspicious long before the affair with my husband began. And that now, he was almost certain she was still hiding something. Someone. That was when it shifted. What had felt like a betrayal suddenly felt like a game I hadn't realized I was part of. Not a triangle, but a web. Not a single affair, but something deeper. I asked him if he ever confronted her. He shook his head. Said he didn't want to see what it would do to him. Said he'd rather be betrayed in silence than humiliated in a fight. I didn't agree. Silence was killing me slowly. But that wasn't the twist. Not yet. The twist came 2 days later, when my husband left his phone on the counter while showering. He never did that. It felt like a trap. But I couldn't resist. My hands moved before I could stop them. There was nothing in the messages. Nothing in the photos. But in his email, a folder. Hidden, buried beneath subfolders labeled with financial terms. Inside, screenshots. Of me. My routines. Photos of me in the backyard. Me at the grocery store. Me leaving the house. Taken from angles that didn't make sense. My breath stopped. They weren't his photos. They were sent to him. By Lena. The metadata on one image showed it had been taken from a second-story window. Her bedroom. She was watching me. Tracking me. Sending reports to my husband like I was some kind of threat. Or property. Or both. I don't know how long I stood there. The water ran in the shower. My husband hummed behind the door like nothing was wrong. I felt something cold unravel inside me. My fingers trembled. Not with fear, but with rage. With clarity. They weren't just cheating. They were managing me. Containing me. Making sure I stayed predictable while they continued their performance. I put the phone back. I didn't say a word. I didn't cry. Instead, I walked to Tom's house that night. He let me in. I showed him what I'd found. I watched his face darken. And then he told me something that made the world tilt again. 2 months ago, he had found a note in Lena's purse. A handwritten list. Names. Dates. Amounts. And at the top, my name. Next to it, a figure. 5 digits. With a line drawn through it, as if it had been updated. The list included other women's names. And a date. In the future. I asked him why he didn't tell me. He said he didn't know what it meant. I did. I just didn't know how yet. But I would. Because this wasn't an affair anymore. This was a setup. Something broke inside me after that night. Not like glass or bone. Something quieter. Like a hinge in the mind, rusted and finally snapping open. I didn't speak to my husband for 2 days. I cooked, I smiled, I kissed him goodnight. But inside, I was documenting everything. Every word, every glance, every misplaced object. I kept a second notebook now. Not one for clues. One for timelines. Because I had started to suspect that this didn't begin when I thought it did. The surveillance. The lists. The manipulation. It felt too precise. Too rehearsed. I began to look back at things I had forgotten. My job offer last year that mysteriously fell through. The time I missed a doctor's appointment because my calendar had been updated on its own. The sudden crash of my laptop 2 months ago, just after I'd opened a document labeled Legal Options. My life hadn't just been invaded. It had been managed, curated, controlled. I started testing him. Small things at first. I told him I'd be going out with a friend and then stayed home, hidden in the shadows of our garage. When he left, I followed. He didn't go where he said he would. Instead, he drove to a park and sat in his car. Alone. For an hour. Then left. No phone calls. No one met him. But I knew something had happened. Something passed between people in silence. I could feel it. I told Tom everything. He had grown quieter, colder. His grief for his marriage had collapsed into something sharper. Not revenge. Not yet. But preparation. He had started keeping his own copies of everything. I asked him about the note again, the list in Lena's purse. He said he didn't know what the numbers meant, but that the handwriting wasn't hers. That was when I realized the scope was larger than just the four of us. Because if it wasn't Lena's writing, and it wasn't mine, then who was organizing this? I began sleeping with the light on. Not because I was scared. Because I didn't want to miss anything. Every sound mattered now. Every creak in the floor. Every flicker of shadow under the door. I installed a small camera under my desk. Not pointed at anyone. Pointed at my files. I wanted to know if they were being touched. 3 days later, the footage showed my husband opening the drawer. He took nothing. Just looked. Like he was checking for something. That same night, he told me he wanted to take a weekend trip. Just the two of us. A cabin outside the city. No signal. No distractions. I agreed. Because I knew I wouldn't go. Instead, I pretended to pack, then claimed illness the morning of. He left anyway. I waited 5 hours, then called Tom. We searched the house, every drawer, every hard drive. We didn't find much. But we did find a USB drive taped under the bathroom sink. It was encrypted. Tom had a friend. A quiet man who asked no questions. The files were opened within hours. Dozens of folders. Photos. Bank transfers. Fake IDs. Surveillance logs. My name. Tom's name. Lena's name. And 2 others. One of them was a woman I'd never met. But she had lived on our street 3 years ago. Her name was marked with a red tag. Deceased. The second was a man. A neighbor from 5 houses down. Moved away last year. Divorce. Sudden. Unannounced. His name was marked as cleared. It was a pattern. Couples. Carefully studied. Broken apart. Then disappeared or relocated. This wasn't about love. This wasn't about cheating. It was something colder. Systematic. Organized. I found a photo in the folder that made me physically recoil. It was of me, sleeping. Taken from inside the room. My bedroom. The angle was impossible. Unless someone had been inside. Or unless the camera had been planted long before. The timestamp was from months ago. Long before I'd suspected anything. I didn't cry. I couldn't. I felt like I had already been emptied. Tom and I sat on his porch again that night. We didn't speak for hours. We just watched the street. Every house looked normal. Lights on. Dogs barking. Children playing. But we both felt it. It wasn't over. It wasn't even close. I asked him what we should do. He said nothing. He told me that 2 days earlier, he had received an anonymous letter. No return address. No handwriting. Just a printed sentence. You're in too deep. Walk away. He burned it. But I knew what it meant. Someone was watching us watching them. I returned home late. My husband was asleep. I stood in the doorway and stared at him. He looked peaceful, content, as if none of it had reached him. I lay beside him, body still, eyes open, and whispered something I didn't understand until later. I hope you're afraid too. The house felt different the next morning. The usual hum of life, the coffee brewing, the children playing outside, seemed too loud, too bright. I had stayed up all night. My mind was filled with images that wouldn't leave me. The files on the USB drive, the woman who had died, the neighbors who had been moved. I felt like a puppet, my strings pulled by hands I couldn't see. The worst part was that I couldn't figure out why. Why us? Why me? But there was one truth that became clearer with each passing minute. It wasn't just my husband I needed to confront. It wasn't just Lena. It was the whole game. I had been blind, thinking it was a simple affair, a betrayal. But the deeper I looked, the more I saw, a much darker web. This was about control. About erasing people. About making them disappear, either physically or emotionally, and rebuilding their lives the way someone else wanted them to. I knew I had to act. But I also knew I had no control left. It wasn't just the affair anymore. It was everything. The files, the people, the strange patterns. They had been watching for years. Planning. Using us. I decided I would confront him. My husband, head on. But not immediately. Not right away. I needed to understand everything first. I couldn't just accuse him of cheating anymore. I needed to show him that I understood what was happening. I needed to prove I was no longer the ignorant woman who smiled through it all. I wasn't playing by their rules. I had made my own. But then, something happened. Something I wasn't prepared for. I had just returned from the store, picking up some milk, when I saw it, a small envelope slipped under my door. No name, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It read, "You know too much now. If you go any further, the next person will be your child." I dropped the paper. I couldn't breathe. For a moment, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. But the reality settled in like cold water over my chest. This wasn't just some threat. This was personal. Whoever was watching me was now threatening my family. They weren't just playing the game. They were controlling it. And I wasn't sure how to stop it. I stood frozen, my hands shaking. I should have told someone. I should have told Tom, but I couldn't. What if they were watching him too? What if this was part of the plan? The realization that I was utterly alone hit me harder than the threat itself. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I called Tom. I told him what had happened. He immediately told me to leave the house, to come to his place. He said it was no longer safe for me, for anyone. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. I had to find out who was behind this, who had been pulling the strings from the beginning. I had no choice but to go through with it. The confrontation would happen, but it would be on my terms, not theirs. So I returned to the house. My heart raced, my thoughts scattered, and I found myself standing in front of him. He was on the couch, his face empty. Like nothing had changed. But I knew everything had changed. I could feel the distance between us growing wider with each second. I sat down next to him and looked him in the eyes for the first time in weeks. He didn't speak. But I knew what he was waiting for. He was waiting for me to break. He was waiting for me to give in. But I didn't. Instead, I whispered, barely above a breath, "Who else is involved?" He froze. His eyes locked with mine. The smile he had been holding back for weeks slowly disappeared. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't guilt. It was fear. The kind of fear I had never seen in him before. And that was when I realized I wasn't the one who should be afraid. It was him. "You're not the only one," he finally said, his voice trembling. "They're everywhere. Watching. You have to stop. It's too late." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had been right. It wasn't just him. It wasn't just Lena. There was a network. A system. And now that I knew too much, I had become part of it. I wanted to scream. I wanted to demand answers. But I knew I wouldn't get them from him. Not now. Instead, I asked the only question that mattered. The question that had been running through my mind for days. Why me? For a long time, he didn't answer. His eyes drifted to the floor, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Then, in a voice barely audible, he said, "Because you were the perfect target." He stood up abruptly, his face contorted in pain. "I never wanted this to happen. I never wanted you to find out. But now it's too late." I could feel the walls closing in. The room felt smaller, tighter. I could hear the pounding of my heart, the panic building in my chest. But in that moment, I realized something. It wasn't just him I was fighting anymore. It wasn't just my husband, or Lena, or the people who had been watching me. I was fighting for control. I was fighting for my own sanity. I didn't wait for him to finish speaking. I didn't need to hear the rest of his lies. I already knew everything. As I walked out of the room, I turned to him one last time and asked, "What will you do now?" He didn't answer. Instead, he looked at me, not with love, not with guilt, but with something colder. Something that told me everything I needed to know. He didn't care. And that was when I realized. The real question wasn't what I would do next. The real question was, what would you do if you were me? End. Thank you for bearing with the narrative journey. I hope it delivers the intensity and unexpected twists you were aiming for. Let me know if you need further tweaks.